All right, so this talk is Angular Loves Data. My name is Stephen Fluin. I'm a developer advocate on the Angular team at Google. I submitted this talk after attending at DevOps BE, and I gave a presentation there on mobile, and there was a really good response to kind of seeing how Angular manifests in different areas of the development world. And so one of the areas that I really feel is a strength for Angular, and an area that we have to deal with a lot as developers, is this concept of consuming and using data that's coming into our application. And so I wanted to talk about some of the ways that Angular interacts with that. But just to make sure we're all starting kind of on the same page, Angular is a platform that makes it easy to build applications with the web. And I use a couple of those terms very specifically. In terms of, I use the term platform because we're really trying to move beyond just being a framework in terms of really owning all parts of the developer workflow, from creating new applications to pulling in data to testing and all that. I also use the term with the web very intentionally because while most Angular applications are built and consumed in a web browser, that's no longer necessary. So if you compare AngularJS to the older version to Angular, we are now DOM independent, and so you can actually run Angular in a lot of very interesting places, such as in a web worker or in a service worker, or even server-side using Angular Universal. So we started getting to know some of the crowd over here, but maybe I'll just do a quick poll here. How many people have written something in Angular, so version 2 or later? Okay, so most of you guys. So if I go too fast, feel free to stop me. If I go too slow, just feel free to come up and kick me and say, hey, I already knew that. The agenda for today is going to be relatively brief. So we're going to go through the component model that lives in Angular. Since most of you have already written in Angular, I'll keep this very short. Then also talk a little bit about reactive programming and RxJS within Angular. Then I'll dive into Firebase, which is a really good way to pull in real-time data into your application. Then I'll move on to GraphQL, which in the real world ends up solving a lot of problems that developers face. And then lastly, we'll talk about a Redux-style pattern from a library called NGRX. So starting off with the Angular component model, most of you have written AngularJS applications. Starting with 1.5 in AngularJS and with every version of Angular after that, we really recommend that everyone build applications in terms of a component model. So instead of a scope and controller, now everything in an application is a component. So if you look at this sample superhero cape store that we've built, or not really built here, you have a lot of products you're selling. You've got details about that content and whatnot. But it's actually all wrapped into an app component. So this is where your application lives and is bootstrapped. Within there, you've got, for example, a nav component. Maybe you have a sale component. Then you can have like multiple instances of a product component. And then components are very often and almost always nested. So you're going to be composing additional components. So for example, within that product component, you might have a button component. And every component under the hood is simply a set of HTML, a set of CSS, and a pure ES6 or ES 2015 class that lets you define the functionality and the behaviors and the properties on that class. So when we look at kind of our Angular application, we really think about it as a tree of components. And so if you contrast what we did in AngularJS from a change detection standpoint, where what we did in AngularJS the old way was we would basically evaluate all of the expressions throughout your entire application, and then we would do it again and see if anything changed, and then we do it again and see if anything changed, and we would do it until everything settled, because we didn't have a very concrete or firm way of knowing what things might have side effects as part of running your application. But whereas now that in Angular, we've moved to this component model, we can be absolutely certain that there should never be a side effect from any of your change detection on the rest of the tree. And we're so certain of that, and we want to help developers ensure that that in development mode, so which is what you're normally developing in when you're in that dev loop cycle, we actually run change detection twice, and if anything changed, we're going to throw an error and say, hey, this is not valid, you've done something wrong. And then we throw away that second change detection cycle in production. The kind of core of what ends up taking this data and this structure and then making it something that can be renderable or viewable within a browser or whatever we're rendering to is all about our templates. So they start with HTML. Then you add in custom components, custom directives. These are things that you're building, all of the different components in your application or any components that you're pulling in from a third-party library. We've got square brackets for property binding. We've got parentheses for event binding. You can combine them if you want double binding. And then lastly, we have expressions and pipes. So one of the important things that you really have to start to understand when you're using Angular is we've eliminated about 40 or 50 of the directives that existed in AngularJS. In Angular, almost everything is either the property or event binding, or one of these built-in kind of structural directives, or a structural directive that you've built yourself. And so these are directives that allow you to create and compose templates in a very kind of natural way, and I'll give a few examples of that. And then the most important thing that I've used in terms of the built-in capabilities when it comes to expressions is this ability to have custom pipes that do something interesting with the data in your expressions. And so this is a pipe async is how you're going to see it. So if we look at an example of this that's going to use both the ngIf and the ngFor structural directives, at the top you have an ngIf, user list pipe async, and you're actually going to see a little bit of version 4 syntax here. So now we've added to the ngIf structural directive the ability to save out local variables. So you don't have to repeat over and over and over that async pipe. We can actually save the results of that async pipe locally. Then we have the user profile, which could be a custom component underneath that, and I'm going to iterate over that with the ngFor structural directive, and I'm going to say let user of users, and then I'll pass in by a property binding the user that I got from that iterator, and then I can use that local variable to pull out the length, and then I could also, for example, create an ng template and call that loading, and then use that somewhere if I wanted to. When we run change detection under the hood in Angular, as I said, it's a single pass across this component tree, but we even take it a little bit further in order to help developers have really well-performing applications. So the first default mode is every time a change detection happens, we're going to evaluate all of your expressions. That's a pretty good default in terms of if you compare what we do in Angular to what we did in AngularJS. It's about 10 times faster, even just doing this runtime check everything process. But we've also given you a few ways to modify what happens during change detection. So the first thing you can do is you can actually modify the change detection strategy on a component by saying it's on push. And what that will do is it will only update the view, and it will only apply change detection to that component, and then therefore all of the components in its tree, if either the inputs to that component change, or if one of the, for example, one of the observables emits a new value. And then there's an even more advanced strategy that you can do, which is not built into the component directive or declaration, but it's a command you can actually do if you inject the change detector, where you can actually completely detach part of your component tree from the change detection. So if it's detached, nothing will trigger a dirty check unless you call mark for dirty check yourself. And then what we do in Angular is we actually trigger all of these events via zones. So we know whenever a task is completed, like a button click or an href call, automatically, and then we can trigger change detection. And because it runs so fast, we can do that relatively often. Angular really loves this concept of immutable data, mostly because of what I talked about in terms of this on-push support, where we can say, hey, most of my tree is not going to change very often, and I can guarantee that it's only going to change when one of the values of the inputs changes. And so when you combine this idea of immutable data, so that we get an entirely new object so we don't have to do deep inspection, plus on-push change detection, your entire application is going to work faster by doing less work. I've heard a quote from a colleague a few years ago, which is that the art of doing less work or maximizing the amount of work not done, excuse me. So if you maximize the amount of work not done, that's when you build really great applications and great products. So the first way that we pull in data now and really connect this back to a real world sort of system is Firebase. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit, if my clicker works. So I was looking at just from memory what sort of products are included in Firebase now. So when it first came out, or when I first started learning about it, it was really just focused on this real-time database. So it's a NoSQL store where the way that you bind into the NoSQL emits new values every time something changes in the back end, which was really exciting because for the first time you can pull up two tabs and get the same data in both of them, and everything syncs in real time. And then they added features like authentication. Now they've added hosting, storage, and then I actually wanted to pull up the website to see what the actual list, because I don't use even all of the features. And it's actually grown quite a bit. And actually a couple months ago, Firebase announced that they acquired Fabric. And so you can expect really Firebase to become this kind of hub of developer productivity and tooling. It's because they have everything from crash reporting, test labs, so run your application on multiple devices if you got an APK or something like that, as well as cool things like just in the last few weeks, I believe we launched Cloud Functions, which is the ability to instead of having to build a server to manage or guard some of the data within your Firebase instance, you can now run JavaScript code directly on our servers for you, and then it will react to changes in the database structure. So I wanted to, yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And I mean, if you look back at this slide, it actually has all of those buttons. So you can add Firebase, you can add to iOS, Android, and web. And I mean, this isn't a Firebase talk, but I'm happy to answer any questions around that as well, because when it gets into mobile, that's where Firebase is investing kind of a lot of time right now in terms of making it great for native mobile. But obviously, you can also build mobile applications with web technologies, right, using Ionic or native script, things like that. So I want to do a tiny bit of live coding here with you guys, and hopefully this is somewhat interesting, as I wanted to build a DevOps chat app from scratch here in just a couple minutes using something called AngularFire. And so AngularFire is a library that we offer as part of the kind of Angular tool suite, even though it's not built by the core team, that allows us to expose a lot of what's going on within Firebase using observables, using patterns that are very familiar within Angular, but then also expose the power of Firebase. So I'm going to jump out to my IDE here. And what I've done is I've scaffolded out using the Angular CLI a brand new CLI project. And so you're going to have a few very simple things. It's going to come with a module. It's going to come with a component. And then it's also going to come with all of the environment configuration, Git configuration, and a set of files for all of your tests. And so the first thing I'm going to do is let's go ahead and try and serve this application. I'll do it in the terminal down here. All right, let's see if this works, ngserve. So this is the CLI command that will spin up a live dev server that will automatically refresh every time it hits save. How many people here use the CLI? Okay. I highly recommend it if you're using Angular. It's probably one of the easiest ways to get started and to kind of continue developing. So I've typed ngserve, and it's gone ahead and built my application. And so on 4200, we should now have a server. So we're seeing AppWorks, and that means our application is actually live and running. So what I'm going to do now is, because it doesn't look the greatest, I'm going to quickly add material design. So I'm going to import material module from Angular material. And then I'm going to add it to my ng module imports. All right, and then it's going to need a tiny bit of CSS here, because otherwise it comes unstyled by default. And I'll just copy and paste this. It resets the styles, the paddings, the margins, things like that, and gives me a little bit nicer look and feel. And then we're actually going to jump up to our HTML, and we're going to use material design. We'll put this in an MD toolbar instead of an H1, and I'll give it the color of primary. And then we'll close that tag. And what we should see now, AppWorks. All right, and that looks just a little bit better, or maybe a little bit less terrible, I should say. And now let's go ahead and pop it into mobile here. All right, now that we've got that, the idea was to build a chat app. So let's go ahead and start building out what might be a chat app for us. So I'm going to build a div here where we're going to put all the messages. And I'll say height 400 pixels, overflow y, scroll, and let's put a border on it. All right, now so in this div, we're going to put all the messages, so I'll come back to that. And at the bottom, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a div. I'll make it display flex, and we're going to put three things in here. We're going to give it an input for the author. So you'll specify what your name is. Give this a local template variable called author. And then we'll say input placeholder equals message. And then lastly, we'll create a button. All right, if we make this one flex 1. This should look like a very simple chat window. Oh, it's just too small. 400 pixels is too much for this group. Let's try 200. All right, now you can see we've got a very simple chat. We've got author, message, and send. So let's go ahead now and actually hook this up to Firebase. And so I already created a Firebase backend. It took about 2 minutes. I can do it again if you guys care. And what that gave me is it gave me this configuration object. So I'm going to copy and paste that here in my app module. Just like I imported material design, I'm going to import AngularFire module from AngularFire 2. And then I'm going to go ahead and add that to my ng module imports as AngularFire module.initializeApp, which then takes that configuration object. All right, so that was now I've connected my client to the Firebase backend, which means I should be able to go into my component now and use dependency injection to get a hold of the AngularFire object. AngularFire. And then I should, in my constructor, be able to say public AF is an AngularFire. We'll just leave that empty. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to define a send, but actually, no, I need to define. So in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that AngularFire object, and I'm going to populate something called messages. So what messages is, it's a object, a Firebase list object. It's going to be a Firebase list object, which actually extends observable. And so it's just a normal observable that you can listen to, you can subscribe to, et cetera. But then they added an additional method on that called push. So I'm going to set this to this.messages equals af.database.list, and we'll just list the messages endpoint on our Firebase server. And then we need to define our send object, our send method. If you remember, it took a message. I believe it was an author and a message in that order. Is that right? Yep. So we're going to say author message. And then just using those local template variables, I should be able to say this.messages.push. And I'm going to give it an object where the author is author.value and a message where it's message.value. And then whenever I hit the send button, we also want to clear those messages. So I'm just going to say this author.value equals message.value equals empty string. So in those 3 lines of code, we are listening for the list of messages, we are pushing new messages up to the server, and we're resetting our local state. So now the only thing I should need to do is actually say what I want those messages to look like. So what we'll do here is we'll just do something relatively simple. So we'll just, in this div, we'll say div ng4 let message of messages pipe async. So the async pipe is actually creating a subscription only to that observable and only within the context of this component. So when this component is not instantiated, when it's not on the screen, for example, if I'm in another route, it's automatically going to dispose of and end that subscription so that we're not wasting resources in order to keep that alive. And then in here, I should be able to say message.message, and then I'll just put by message.author. And I forgot to close something here, just like I did it. Perfect. All right, so we have author, message, and a send button here. So let's say this is Stephen. Hi, everybody. And let's hit send. So that message popped up right away because we're seeing a full round trip to the server. And if you actually pull up side by side 2 of these, we'll just duplicate the tab, pull this one off. What a great audience. That's you guys, just FYI. Oh, and I forgot, I was going to make this big announcement about make sure you turn off your Wi-Fi so that it doesn't, didn't quite need that one today. All right, and as you saw, all of that happened in real time, and you can actually use the Firebase Dev Inspector to see what's going on in real time. All right, let's jump back to the slides. So does that make sense what we just built? So we just built a real-time chat app. We didn't add authentication. We could if we wanted to, if you guys care, when we have extra time. But it really just shows the power of the real-time database and the ease of synchronizing in those objects in, where I get access to these properties via observables, and then I can render them however I want, using the kind of declarative template syntax in Angular. You can actually do a lot of very powerful things because we're doing this all via observables in RxJS. And so this is an example of where I'm taking two different features of Firebase and combining them into a single stream. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the auth data. So Firebase has a full authentication workflow which supports Google, Twitter, a bunch of others. And then as soon as we get a new event, so which would happen anytime a user clicks a login button, clicks a logout button, the state of their authentication is going to change. And so we're going to get this state object out. And then what I'm doing is I'm checking and I'm saying if there's no state, then I'm just going to give them a false back. And I'm going to emit that false. But if there is state, then I'm going to return another observable, which is actually a database lookup based on this other endpoint. And so this looks a little bit complicated, but what it's doing and what it gives you as a developer is now I get a stream of data about the user that updates automatically whenever they sign in or sign out. So we're pulling in the combination of auth data and user data into a single stream so that I can do things like ngIf auth.isAdmin, right? And I can just in one line say, do a full check for who is this user and what are their permissions. And then, for example, if in the back end of the application someone removes their permissions, in real time that'll actually flow and the view will re-render. Or vice versa, right? I've tried to do something and I didn't have permissions and I asked my admin, hey, can I get access to do that thing? If they add permissions in real time, my screen will actually re-render as it gets those new permissions because the auth state will change and that the property of that observable will update. And then I'll immediately have this very reactive feeling to my application because it will be based on whatever's happening in real time within the database. And you can actually use this paradigm to do any sort of level of role-based access control, right? So you can define 5 different roles within your application and check for them, each of those permissions or each of those roles in a very same way. Firebase also has a really good permissions model. So one of the things that we have trouble thinking about a lot of times is how do we secure this data, right? Now that we're moving more and more code from the back end into the front end, how do you make sure it's secure? And so what Firebase does is it gives you the ability to set rules at any level of the tree. We'll go through a couple examples here. So in my users list, I give any user write access to their own data. So /users/ my own user ID will work only if my user ID matches what the authentication has given me. A little bit more complicated example is that volunteers role that I talked about, where someone maybe we're maintaining this list of volunteers that exists in our application. And I can only write this if the currently authenticated user exists in the /admins section, right? So I'm looking at the root of my database here, looking at admin plus their user ID. And if that has been set, which only admins have permission to set that, then I know that this user is allowed to update the volunteer status of the users. And then we have a much more complicated rule here, which I'll just explain very briefly. You can do kind of much more complicated lookups. So this is one where we've given that volunteer role access to just one parameter on a larger object. The use case for this was we were actually building a conference website. We built it with this idea that we have admins and we have visitors, right? Visitors can see everything and not touch anything. Admins can edit anything. But then the week before, we realized that we needed to empower volunteers that were helping us run the event to actually make notes on the conference. So like, hey, this room's full or there's 2 seats left and whatnot. And so we didn't want to complicate the permission model too much, but we were able to create this role just by having a /volunteers endpoint. And then we added this additional check that said, volunteers are only allowed to access and edit this endpoint if they're editing the notes, right? So they can't change the name of a speaker, they can't change the name of a session, but they can access and modify the notes of a session. So this is that combination of looking up whether they're an admin, if that exists, or looking up whether they're a volunteer, and then combining that with a parameter lookup. A lot of developers that come to conferences and I talk to, they're always like, tell us secrets about Angular. Do you guys want to hear secrets? Yeah. Okay. That gentleman gets to hear all the secrets. So in general, Angular is relatively public. So pretty much all of the source code that we write ends up on GitHub. So if you paid a lot of attention to every commit that we write, you would know pretty much everything that's going on. But this is one that not a lot of people have seen, and we haven't talked about before, but one that I'm in particular very excited about. So one of the features that's coming to AngularFire is that we are going to start lazy loading and modularizing it. So if you use AngularFire today, what ends up happening is we load about 400 kilobytes of additional kind of bundle size into your application, which is the entirety of the Firebase SDK for web, which is pretty big when we're trying to build applications that are kind of under 250 KB and so on. And so what we've been working with David East actually on, who's the original author of AngularFire, is we've come up with a paradigm where we do lazy loading. And so what happens is because all of the AngularFire methods for authentication, for database lookups, et cetera, they're all asynchronous. What we can do is we don't actually want to load the AngularFire or the Firebase library until you actually use it. And so what this means is that because we have this in Angular, we have this very nice lazy loading concept where you can have a module that is lazy loaded into your application so that your users to your homepage don't pay for that extra bundle size. We can take it one step further, and until on one of your components you actually try using authentication, we're not going to pull in the authentication part of Firebase. Or until you start using database, which is the biggest part of Firebase, we don't actually need to pull that in. And so we believe that once this is complete, we can actually get it to a point where none of that you don't pay for any of that dependencies until you're ready to actually pull data down, which is really exciting. And it's a model that we kind of want to see replicated across the ecosystem, because a lot of times, if you can save library cost and save bundle size and save it defer it, that's a very desirable thing, so you get that nice first time to interactive for users for your applications. So the last section, the next section, excuse me, I want to talk about a little bit is GraphQL. How many people here have written or seen GraphQL? Okay, half. So GraphQL is actually a relatively exciting technology. So we're all used to building out these API endpoints and RESTful endpoints and microservices and whatnot, which is fantastic, right? It's a great way of building applications. But then what you end up having to do is you have to build this middle layer where you have to perform all these lookups. You're saying, hey, I want my data to look like this. How do we go and get that little bit of data from these 6 endpoints and make it useful on my client-side application so that I'm not doing 50 different lookups or 6 different lookups to that backend. And what GraphQL does is it allows you to, it's a transport protocol that allows you to do those lookups very declaratively. So this is stolen from the GraphQL website, but basically you provide a type. So here you've got a project which has a name, which is a string. You've got a tagline that's a string, and contributors. And then you write a GraphQL statement, which looks like this. You say project, and I only want projects where name is equal to GraphQL. And then I want the tagline object. So I'm specifying not only the objects I want in terms of here's the filters and here's the criteria, but then also what fields and what data I want back. And then what you get back is exactly what you asked for. And you'll see they look almost identical, right? So now I've got a JSON object with that project, and there's the tagline for that project. So you'll notice 2 things here. It's very typed. So you're specifying string, number, et cetera, whatever data type you want to get back. But it's also very declarative. Does that sound familiar? That looks exactly like how we do the kind of Angular philosophy on designing templates. And so there's a project called Apollo, which is from the team at Meteor. And so what Apollo is it's both a server side that handles all of the GraphQL resolution and a client-side library that allows you to do lookups. And so what you can do is you can set up a server-side GraphQL or Apollo instance that knows about your data types, and you can say, hey, here are my 6 endpoints. This one's a SQL Server database. This is a MySQL database. And then maybe I'm going to go pull in some JSON-based weather API. And once you give it information on how to resolve those endpoints and resolve that data, then you can make GraphQL queries to it from a client, and it will automatically figure out, OK, in this instance, I need to go query this endpoint. In this instance, I need to go query these 3 and then combine the data. And so it handles all of that data resolution for you. And what's nice is then, because of how Apollo is written and how well it integrates with Angular, is we can actually combine queries that come from multiple different components and batch them into a single request. Right? So if I have a request coming from my toolbar, and I've got a request coming from my side nav bar, and then I have a request that's on some specific content page, typically that would be 3 requests to a backend API if you had to design the middle layer yourself, or if you didn't have access to build a middle layer for yourself. And so what GraphQL does, it actually allows you to have all of those things automatically aggregated by the Apollo client within Angular. and then it makes a single request to the server, and then stores that in a Redux store within Angular. So what does this actually look like? So first, you need to write a query. So you can see that we've got this GraphQL tag method that's using the new template literal syntax, where we're giving it just the declarative syntax of, hey, I'm creating a query. I want a feed object, so in that feed object, give me the current user and the login. And then I also want to know when that feed was created and what score it had. Then what you can do within your Angular component is you just do a watch query or a query. And so this is, you basically give it that query that you just defined. So you give it that GraphQL query, and then you assign it to a local object. So this data is now an observable of the responses from that GraphQL query. And so we know what this data is going to emit because it's exactly what we wrote here in the GraphQL query. And because everything's strongly typed on the back end, we know exactly the types of every object that we're going to get back. And then, now that you have this object in this data parameter within my component, it's really, really easy to iterate over that. So we've got let entry of data, pipe async, because it's just a pure observable. And then they've actually added additional pipe called select that lets you do client-side filtering of result sets in order to help take advantage of some of the caching that they built into it. So here I can iterate over all of the entries that came back from that data set, and then I can render out to the screen, for example, the score from that entry. So does that make sense? I talk to people about GraphQL, and it's kind of weird because it's this magical thing where you're like, oh, I just tell it what I want and it gives it to me. But a lot of the magic ends up being in the resolvers. So this server-side piece where you say, here's the 3 databases that it comes from. Obviously, if you already have a NoSQL store and you've architected it in a very logical way for client-side development, it's about the same effort. But most of the times, we're working in companies that don't have that, right? GraphQL is actually very similar to, I believe, Netflix Falcor. Is that right? Dr. Netflix? Conceptually. Okay. So Netflix actually, I believe they were kind of the pioneers of this concept where we have all of these microservices across the company, and it's really kind of a pain to have to build these middle tiers. And so using things like Falcor, I can say, hey, declaratively say, this is the data I want back. And so GraphQL does that exact same thing, if I understand correctly. But GraphQL is all based on open standards, whereas Falcor is a little bit more proprietary, I believe. GraphQL is intended to be an open transport protocol, and I believe they give you a reference server and they give you some tools for testing and inspection, just so you can see what my GraphQL query would return on the server side. But they leave it open for people to build their own clients and servers, which is what Apollo does to make this a very nice end-to-end experience. The next piece that I want to talk about is a project called NGRX Store. So this is from NGRX, which is reactive extensions for Angular. So this was a project, actually, I believe it was founded in part by Rob Wormald, who's on the Angular team. He's my another developer advocate on the team. So what basically this allows you to do is it allows you to take the Redux pattern of immutable data and apply it in Angular in a very kind of nice ergonomic way. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the Redux pattern, or how many people here know about Redux? Okay, nobody knows about Redux. Awesome. Of course you do. We knew that. So the Redux pattern is an emerging trend in development where we're very used to having local state and managing kind of state ourselves. So manually within my application, every time an event happens, I go and say, what does this event mean for my world? And then anytime I have that event happen, anywhere in my application I have that event happen, I have to say, okay, in this case, I want it to do this. In this case, I want it to do this. What Redux does is it allows you to say, hey, I'm going to have this very simple set of concepts, and then I'm going to apply them rigorously throughout my application. So the first concept is an action. So this is something that happens in my application, either as a response to something that happens on the server side, or as a response to something that the user has done. And so if we look at an example here, let's say I'm building a very simple counter. Right? So you can increment it, you can decrement it, or you can reset it. So we're defining 3 actions that you can take within my application. And obviously this is a little bit contrived, right? It would be very simple to manage a counter locally, but it's much more complex when you have nested objects, deep inspection, and objects that are coming kind of across an application where you've got maybe 30 or 100 different data types. So then you combine these actions with a set of what are called reducers. But basically what a reducer does is it takes a state So your initial state is maybe my counter is 0. And then you combine that with the action, and you return a new state. So in this case, we have our counter reducer, and it takes in whatever state we had at the time, and it takes in an action. So if we had an increment action, then we're going to return the state as it is today, which is that counter, and we're going to increment it by 1. If you decrement, we're going to reduce it by 1, and then we're going to return that new state. And then what we do is we have a selector, which is actually going to now select that piece of data out of our data store. And so we're going to get this.counter equals store.select and give it counter. And so in this use case, in this example, this.counter is an observable that emits a new value every time an action is applied. And then there you can see that we've got 3 methods that are maybe hooked into our HTML, so an increment, decrement, and a reset, that just dispatch that event. And so while you can definitely do this yourself in simple cases like counters, I talked about how this can really help more complex cases. And one of the ways that it does this is because the data is immutable, the store actually keeps a copy of every previous state, if you want it to. And so what it can do is you can actually do something called time travel, where if you're inspecting your application, there's a bunch of Chrome extensions and tools to do this, you can actually see every action that's applied to within your application and see the order it's applied in, and then step back through your application. And because these are just observables, when I set, if I hit plus, plus, minus, minus, plus, right, the end state would be 1. But if I hit back, then the end state's going to go back to 0, and I can see how that ripples through my entire application. And so if I have a series of actions that have to happen, right, maybe I'm building a web store where I have to charge the person's credit card, I have to validate their address, and all of these things are happening in different places in the application, I can actually see how each of those actions affects the state. And the state is very centrally managed and very clear to understand. And then these selectors allow me to just get out a very narrowly targeted piece of that state, so that you get that kind of reactive feel to your components so that they're changing behaviors every time you get new data. And it's very fast and very performant in large applications because of things like onPush, where we know we only have to render once that state is changing. We don't have to do any sort of comparison to the objects. We say, hey, we've got a brand new state object, let's re-render. So here was the HTML that would go along with that counter, right? So you click, you get an increment, we're rendering that counter via the async pipe, which is automatically doing that subscription. And once again, if you don't subscribe to an observable, it's a cold observable. You don't actually pay any costs for that. So every time the counter changes, if I wasn't listening to that, we don't re-render it, we don't process that at all. And then I have a decrement and a reset button. So hopefully this has made some sense about how Angular really focuses on the ways that you can have data within your application, how we can reflect that within your view, and we can make that very easy to both manage and to mutate. And then there's a ton of kind of open source libraries such as Firebase, such as NGRX, such as GraphQL and Apollo that make it even easier to do this when you've got maybe 100 developers or 1,000 developers or megabytes of data and state information that you need to be managing across a large application. And you might not always be able to know and understand everything that's going on at one given point in time. And these sorts of tools can help you with that. So first, thank you guys for coming. And then I want to jump into, is there anything that you guys want to see or questions you want to ask about Angular? Because I'd be happy to kind of continue our little demo here, build it out, add auth, or anything you guys are interested in seeing. Yeah? So are you talking about you said initialization of the data? Visualization of the data. So that's relatively straight. The visualization of the data really just comes into how do you want to render your templates. So do you have, are you thinking charting libraries? Yeah, there's a number of different charting libraries. So we've got, for example, Wijmo has Angular support. There's something called ngchart. And so there's a lot of very advanced charting libraries, and this is something that we're continuing to work on. So for example, we're working on an Angular material data table, but the ones that already exist, such as ngchart, they already support things like lazy loading of content, infinite scrolling, all those sorts of things. So I would probably, if I had to build something today, I would probably use ngchart. I believe I can pull that up here. So it's by Valor Software. Sorry, I'm mixing up charts and data tables because almost in every large-scale application we have both, right? A lot of financial institutions end up using charts and data tables. So there's another demo that I recommend you take a look at. There's a gentleman by the name of Alex Castillo, and what he's built out is a random data visualization. And so he randomly fluctuates data at like 1 million times a second, and then he's trying to render that out on a visual, just throwing colors and whatnot, just to show off the change detection performance and the reflowing and the layout. So if you look up Alex Castillo visualization demo, you'll see a really cool kind of like fancy color rendering, which is not really useful in the real world, but very handy to understand what's going on under the hood in terms of change detection and rendering. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So, in my situation, we have REST API.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, the WebSockets were filtered, unfortunately, out and locked.
Enterprise. We've been there. Yep.
Enterprise. Yeah. So we ended up pulling back to like a long pulling mechanism. But I'm just curious, like, what's the current correct thing to do with regard to that issue? Is it still WebSockets handling of that in Angular 2?
Sure. So. WebSockets are obviously the ideal answer, I would say, for most use cases that are using RESTful backends. If you were building GraphQL, for example, GraphQL actually has built-in polling, and so it will, based on whatever interval you give it with whatever backoff you want, automatically pull and refresh the data. So in the GraphQL, there's like a client.ts file where you can specify what sort of window you want to use for batching and how frequently you want to be refreshing that data. But that's in the GraphQL world. GraphQL also supports real-time data, just like Firebase, but you obviously need a database engine that supports like triggers and notifications and whatnot, which most current existing database setups aren't kind of built to do. When it comes to just building a pure Angular application where you're doing RESTful data queries, I would definitely love to do WebSockets, but if you don't have WebSockets, then you're going to be long polling. What's nice about Angular is because everything's an observable, you can do interesting things like debounce your requests or have exponential backoff at the observable level. So you define, hey, here's this HTTP endpoint, here's how we want to process the data that's coming in. Maybe I want live refresh, maybe I want whatever. But then from your component, when you're actually designing how you want that to look and render and flow in your application, it's exactly the same, right? You just assuming I'm getting a stream of data that's going to update whenever I get that data, and then you leave all of that other stuff to the definition of the stream, which is very nice.
Yeah, I think that we're going to just in UX to take advantage of observables in that way. You don't have to do too much manual updating and listening to all
of Sure. I'll actually show you one strategy here. Let's see if I can find it. So on Monday in Melbourne, Australia, I ran a workshop for about 100 people, and one of the things we did is we talked about simple data caching. So if you're using an API endpoint, one of the questions that a lot of people that are new to Angular ask is why do you use observables instead of promises, right? Promises resolve exactly once, and they either succeed or fail, and they can be canceled. But then observables have the very similar functionality. But in an HTTP request, you're only going to get one response, right? Or 0 or 1 responses, theoretically. But the reason we do it with observables is because of what you said, where often I'm pulling from multiple backends, or I need to live poll, or I need to retry, things like that. And so observables let me do some very kind of interesting and very cool things. So simple HTTP caching. One of the things you can do with this observable is first you subscribe to it, and then anytime new data comes in via HTTP, cache that into local storage, and then using an observable operator called start with, you start with that data. And so what happens is the first time you load the application, the observable is going to emit a new value. We're going to save it to local storage and render it to the screen, right? Because you've got 2 subscribers on that information. And then the second time that you hit refresh, we're going to instantly render the version from local storage. And then as soon as that HTTP request comes back, it's going to update. And not only is it going to update the UI, but again, because it's a stream, it's going to update that saved version. And so this is how quick that can look like. So at the top, we have a normal HTTP call in, I can make this big, I'm sorry about that. We have a normal HTTP call where we're going to say http.get, and we're going to give it a path, and we're going to take the response and turn it, get its JSON. But then what I'm doing is, as I said, I'm going to subscribe to that and store a JSON version of that called activity cache. And then the version that I actually render to the screen is activities.startWith, and then I pass in that local storage version. And so you do this and you instantly get offline capabilities, right? So if you combine this with a service worker, which in Angular is now just one flag in the CLI, so you say service worker equals true, all of your vendor.js, your index.js, et cetera, get cached in that service worker. So your user has a poor internet connection or loses their internet connection, they're just fine. We're going to serve all of the functional side of things from the cache manifest. And then your user's data is still there because we're doing this very simple caching into the HTTP or into the local storage. Does that make sense? Yeah. I built a much more complicated version of this about a year ago where it did first check if it's in memory, then check if it's disk, and then check if it goes and gets from the internet. I did it in promises, and it was a nightmare. Using observables, it's much, much cleaner. Because doing this idea of starting with a value, it's very hard with promises because you need to figure out, okay, has the promise resolved? If the promise hasn't resolved, then we need to set some local state, and you have to manage these two separate states, whereas all of this flows through a single observable. All right. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe there are two, correct me if I'm wrong. You guys didn't go with that, right?
Correct.
I guess I was just wondering if you could, more so that when somebody brings it up again to me, I can tell them why.
Sure. Sure.
From everything you've been saying, it sounds like most of the rendering issues and everything are taken care of with Angular 2, and I'm just curious, what's the difference?
Yep. So we don't need a virtual DOM because what we do is we do all of the diffing at ES6 class level. So we evaluate the expressions in your class, and then that gives us a state, and then if that state has changed, then we render out just the changes. So we have a renderer. So what actually ends up happening is you write these declarative HTML templates, and then it actually ends up being compiled into JavaScript. So VM optimized document.create element, et cetera. And so in general, we don't need virtual DOM because we're just doing this kind of object level diffing or on push change detection, and then we propagate out the changes. Yeah.
We are using Couchbase. Since we are using Redux
Mm-hmm.
as data, we cannot change the database.
Sure.
In Angular, is there a special support for Couchbase like Firebase?
So I'm not aware of a library. I mean, the ecosystem is huge, so there might be someone that's already built helper tools. But with Couchbase, are you looking for like real-time sync, or what features of Couchbase are you looking for help with? Because I mean, Couchbase obviously offers a RESTful API, right? So that you can just, isn't it a NoSQL database that also exposes a RESTful API? I'm not a Couchbase expert. So I mean, you can always just do the HTTP calls, but it would be interesting to hear what you're hoping for from a library like that. All right. Well, I think we're a little bit. Oh, sure. Well, let's just do one more question, then people can come up after and ask questions.
You were just kind of implementing the web socket.
Mm-hmm.
I was just looking into the server-side events. Would you recommend web sockets instead of the server-side?
I've never heard of server-side events. What are server-side events? Like push notification? Like?
What is it? Test event streams was a kind of a media type. So if you put this in your REST services, you could have in your Angular, you could have an event source and with a message, and you just get the information from the server, and then you would have about the same thing as the event into the web socket.
So I'm not familiar with that. So you'll have to tell me more about that. Has anybody else heard of that?
And it's a little bit older in the technology, I think. I mean, websites and everything kind of relate to that, but certain infrastructure. I have the same problem that you do actually, where
kind of hit a problem, and I was wondering if the server-side events solve that.
So-
It's mostly your infrastructure, because usually what happens is you have a network device or an Apache server or something run, if they don't have all the modules configured for all that stuff and to flow through, then it doesn't matter what you do on your side.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're very, in a lot of environments, you're totally hands-off on the server, and so none of the cool things that we want to enable, we can enable. Because like, for example, in web applications, we now have push notifications, right? So if I build if I add a service worker to my application, I can now wake up my application from the internet whenever I want to send a notification, or whenever I say, hey, new data is here. Which that would theoretically solve your problem too, right? Just we'll send a push notification to the user whenever stuff changes. But if you don't have the backend infrastructure to do that, that doesn't help. All right, well, thank you guys so much, and I'll be around for chatting later. Oh, two other really quick announcements. Sorry, I should have said this earlier. Number one, version 4 is planned on being released today, which is really exciting. It should be a very easy upgrade. Shouldn't break everything. Should just make your application bundle smaller. And we add a couple of new features that one of them I mentioned, the new ng-if syntax. So that's a big deal. That should be pretty good for you guys. Second, it's my birthday.